Good morning, everyone. Greetings of peace and prosperity. This is Insarli Timbal, and I'll be discussing the English literature during the Old English period. Old English period is also known as the Anglo-Saxon period, influenced by the Germanic groups who invaded Britain, namely the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. This period started from 410 to 1066 AD. During this period, literature are mostly oral in nature, and in terms of written prose and poetry, there is only a handful of texts which have survived, and there is no reason to assume that a lot of more was actually written because the oral tradition seems to be the more dominant during these times. There are two kinds of poetry during the Old English period. The first one we have here is the heroic poetry, and the second one we have the religious poetry. But before we're going to tackle them even more, let me first give you a background of the people behind this works. Okay, so there were two kinds of people living in Britain during this period. The original people, which were called Britons, so they are Christians, and we have the invaders, which are known as Germanic tribes, the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes. They are pagans. They are pagans or pagan people who do not believe in God, so they were talking about heroism in their poetry. Okay, so now we have the heroic poetry. So there was a very significant poetry which I'm sure you have heard about. It's the Beowulf. What's interesting about this poem is that we don't know the author, neither we were aware of the name. So it was named Beowulf because when they read the manuscript, they read the name Beowulf, so they named the poem Beowulf. But Beowulf is not really the original name, the actual name of the work. Beowulf is a poem about a Scandinavian warrior who had a battle with a monster named Grendel. So after that, followed by an attack by Grendel's mother, and years later, the hero Beowulf is again confronted by a dragon. So this poem speaks about leadership that Beowulf had. Okay, so here's the comparison of the manuscript letter of Beowulf and the modern letters. So it's the introduction part of the poem. So as we can see here, the manuscript letter during the Old English period is something that we can't really understand. We can't read it, but when translated to modern letters, it's more understandable and readable, right? Okay, so religious poetry examples are the following. So the first one we have here is the works of Caedmon and Kenilworth. These two names dominate the discussion, and there is every reason to assume that the poetry was written soon after the conversion of the Anglo-Saxon into Christianity because there are a lot of Christian elements built into the discussion, into the subject matter, into the treatment, so on and so forth. So mostly the themes were biblical and religious in nature. So one of the works of Caedmon was the Caedmon's Hymn. So it's originally an oral hymn composed by a cowherd named Caedmon. This is the earliest example of a poem written in English. It was recorded much later in writing by the learned monk Bede in his Ecclesiastical History. So the poem is written in Latin in some extant copies and in Anglo-Saxon and a few others. In this poem's 18 lines, readers can find, even in the translations, an example of the four-beat line typical of Anglo-Saxon poetry in which Beowulf is also written. So with Ken Wolf, one of his works is where he talks about a wandering person and a lover of pleasure who is converted by a vision of the cross. So another example of religious poetry during the Old English period is Dior. So Dior is another important poem of the manuscript which has survived into the posterity. This is a poem of just 42 lines, and the subject matter is quite interesting. It's about the complaints of a minstrel who after years of service to his lord was replaced by a rival. So this also throws a lot of light into the daily life of Old English times, and we also get a glimpse to many famous legends of the old Germanic times. So the other significant writing was The Dream of the Rood, and this is a very predominant example of religious poetry. So the Dream of the Rood primarily talks about the event in crucifixion in a very symbolic way, and the entire story is also narrated by a participant who witnessed the act of crucifixion. Thank you so much for listening. God bless everyone.